Hey guys, I wanted to put this video together to show you how to create your terrain within Unity 2019. I've gone ahead and opened up my own Unity 2019 project here. I have an empty window. And I also imported 3 textures into my scene. Now these are just JPEGs. I found just some royalty-free ones online, but these are seamless images and they maintain a resolution of 1024 by 1024. And the 3 I have here are cliff, mossy rock, and sand. Actually, my sand's a little smaller, but that should be fine. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a terrain. I'm going to sculpt it, and then I'm going to set up these textures as paintable textures on the terrain as well. So what I want you guys to do for your project is create a piece of terrain, edit it with the terrain tools, as well as paint the individual textures that you have, up to 3, on that terrain. So let's go ahead and do that. So inside this Unity project, the first thing we're going to do is create a game object, 3D object, and we're going to come down to terrain. Okay, once we make that terrain, we'll get this terrain object that appears within our scene. And right off the bat, it might be a shade too big for what we're trying to do. This one actually looks ginormous. So let's go ahead and reduce the size of this a little bit. To do that, I can come into my settings here and come down to terrain width and height. So right now it's 1,000 by 1,000 meters, which is pretty big. You'll also notice I'm getting a little bit of slowdown in my Unity, and there might be some weird issues like that happening in your editor, and that has to do with the baked lighting. So first thing we're going to do is let's change the size of our terrain. So I'm going to make this something a little more manageable. We'll just do 300 by 300. Okay, and then the next thing I'm going to do is take this baking off so Unity runs a little bit faster, because it will go kind of slow if it's constantly trying to bake, especially with terrain. So to do that, I'm going to come up to Window, Rendering, Lighting Settings. And then actually, let me go ahead and drag this lighting window over here so you can see it. So we have this lighting settings window. In here, what we want to do is make sure that auto generate right here is checked off. Okay, if we turn auto generate off, that'll stop that baked lighting from happening. The next thing you want to do is, because it's already baked some stuff, or it might have in your project, you'll see right here it has one directional light map with a shadow mask, right? We're gonna go ahead and eliminate that so we can just deal with our real-time lighting in our scene. Okay, and if to eliminate the pre-baked lighting that's in there, if that's in there, it might cause some issues when you start applying textures and things of that nature. So let's just go ahead and delete this. We're going to take that out. If I go to generate lighting, I'll go to clear baked data, and that will eliminate that. And if you look back at your scene, we can go ahead and close this out. I should have a nice scene with real-time lighting and no baked textures happening. And it will look like a grid. That's kind of the prototype basic texture they throw on there for you in 2019. That should be good to go. Okay, so with our terrain selected, with this 3D terrain selected, first thing we want to do is actually modify this terrain to make some mountains and hills and whatever we want to do for our project. So to do that, I can come into my settings at the top right here. If we look at our object, remember, every object in Unity is a series of components, right? So we have our game object, which is a terrain object, and what makes it a terrain object is this terrain component, okay? In this terrain component settings, we have a couple different things going on. We can first create neighbor terrains if we want, but we don't need to worry about that because we're only dealing with this one piece of terrain. And if you remember, I came in and resized that to 300 by 300. So go ahead and do that if your terrain's a little big. Then at the top, I'm going to ignore this create neighbor terrains, because we're not really building a giant world where we need a lot of terrains right now. We're just building one. So I'm just going to ignore that. I'm going to come right to this paint setting right here. And when we're in this paint terrain setting, you're going to notice a couple of different options in this dropdown. We have raise lower terrain, paint texture, set height, smooth height, stamp height. Okay, what we want to go to is raise lower terrain. Okay, set height has to do with setting an actual height of our terrain. If we wanted to globally set a height value right off the bat, but we don't need to worry about that right now. This is more for if we wanted to carve downwards into stuff. We'd have to first give it some height and then move the terrain down, and then you'd have some built-in height to actually carve out lakes and things like that. But we'll ignore that for now. We're just going to raise our terrain. Okay, so I'm going to click on Raise Terrain, and in my Raise Terrain settings, you'll notice I have these different brushes that are available for me to paint with. Right? If I come here, I've got this little brush, and on my actual terrain, you'll notice a preview of that brush. If I increase my brush size, you'll see the preview of that brush increase as well. If I increase the opacity, you'll see that also preview as well. And you kind of see a faint little preview of how that's going to look before you start stamping it down. So I'm just going to come in here and adjust these brush sizes and start kind of modifying this terrain a little bit to build some simple little mountains and hills right around my scene. Right, so I'll just come around this terrain, and I'll just come in here and stamp out some little mountains. Okay, and all I'm doing is using these terrain brushes to come in and stamp these out. Now, it's okay if it goes up on your edges like that for now. Don't worry about that. We could always come in with a brush and push those down, but for now, we'll just, just get creative and come in here and just create, a scene that looks good to you. Okay, so I'm just going to come in here and I'm just tapping around with this brush to kind of just make some little hills and valleys and mountain objects, things of that nature. All right. So in our next project, we're actually going to be combining terrain and Pro Builder. And I'll show you guys a nice demo for that. But for this, I just wanted to kind of come in here and show you the basics of editing terrain. Now, I'm only using this one brush that they give you, but you could come in here and mix it up with some different ones to kind of vary that terrain. Maybe give it a little more erosion look to it. Right? Come here and there and just kind of paint out some other areas. Okay. Now, going back to our brushes, if I go to this faded orbital brush right here, it's just kind of like a faded raise brush. One of the nice things about this brush is if we come down in our drop down to our set height function, right, you'll notice it has some options here. It says left click to set height, hold shift, and left click to sample the target height, right? So in my scene right here, if I just reduce my brush size and I hold the shift key down, anywhere on the height of my terrain, I can set an actual height to paint terrain from. So it's kind of like the raised lower terrain, except you're using a set height to actually paint on. So this is great if you're trying to paint platforms or roads or passageways or things like that, but you all kind of want it to be level, right? So if I set a height, so I'll sample a height in here. Now we can see that by looking at this height value, right? Right now it's set to 0, right? But if I come in here, hold my shift key, and just select, let's just select a height on one of the mountains here, like right here. You'll see it, oh, it's 34 units high, right? So now if I paint, everything I paint will be set at that 34 units high. So this is really cool if you want to, start creating little zones for your characters to move upon. If you come down here, let's sample this one. And I'll do a little passageway that maybe cuts through these little mountains right here. It goes up to this piece, right? You can get some really interesting effects by just using the set height function, especially if you're doing level design and you need to really plan something out, right? I can come in here, maybe shift select a halfway point and then paint, something in between, right? Or maybe in between that, do another one right here, maybe between that, do another one right here. You just kind of stair step it. So you can do a lot of nice little functions just by using this tool. The other tool that's nice is you'll notice I have some kind of weird things happening with the geometry right here. If I want to come in and smooth this together, I can come back down to my drop down and go to the smooth height brush right here. And I can actually blur some of these together so there's just a more of a natural transition so it's not so extreme on the drop off. Right? You'll notice it kind of like smooths those edges. Okay, if you have any like really bitty terrain or terrain that looks like super stretched, things like that, you can come in with this smooth brush and just kind of smooth out some of those areas. It also helps give it kind of a more natural look when you need it. So I'll just come in here. I'll just kind of smooth around, right? Okay. So we'll keep that for now as my little level, right? I'm going to come back to my raise lower terrain brush, and in here, again, I can just grab some of these detail brushes and maybe just kind of add some little detail elements to some of these little passageways I made so they're not so extreme, right? So come in here, kind of paint these up a little bit. Come over here, maybe I'll paint some of that, right? Kind of just helps add a little bit of detail so it looks a little more natural. All right, so we'll say that's good for now. Maybe I'll just stamp this one so it looks a little more rocky up there. There you go. Right, okay. All right, so we've modified our terrain. We've used some terrain brushes to modify the terrain, and we've used some other brushes to help smooth out and create some areas for our players to run on using the set height and smooth height functions, right? But if we look at our terrain right now, you know, the one thing that's pretty glaring to us right when we see it is we have this texture on there that's just like this checkerboard pattern. We don't really have a nice built-in painted texture on there to work with. Okay, but we're going to go ahead and change that. So if you remember when I started this tutorial, I had these 3 textures in here that we can work from. And you'll notice when I created that terrain as well, it created this other game object called new terrain. Anytime you create a terrain, it creates a prefab or terrain asset for this particular terrain. So if you wanted to use it again and again in other scenes, you have that terrain already set. Any values you apply to this particular object will be saved in this terrain object. And it's a good idea when you do create terrain, if we just said level 1 terrain, be descriptive on the terrains because it will just keep building new terrain 1, new terrain 2, new terrain 3, etc. So you can accidentally delete those if you have, you know, a bunch of terrains named new terrain, this, that, whatever, right? Okay, so we have our terrain. It's looking good, but again, we want to paint some textures on here. So the new terrain system in 2018 and 2019 in Unity uses, if I go to my paint texture, it uses terrain layers to apply materials to your terrain. So before, we were able to, in older versions of Unity, just apply the textures into the palette and we could do it, but now they have a layering system built in. And the way the layering system works is you actually need to create terrain layers to then bring into your Unity palette, and then you can use those layers to actually paint the terrain. And the reason they have the layers is because each layer is associated with material types using their standard shader that you can adjust. So it's kind of a nicer way of, you know, having these different layers. You know, if you want to do water layers, you know, rough surface layers, glossy surface, things like that, you can do that now with their layering system. Okay, so what I want to do is apply these textures as terrain layers so I can paint this guy up, right? So the first thing we need to do is create our initial layer. Now you want to have your textures sitting in your project when you do this, but we'll start with let's go ahead and start with the sand texture as our first layer. And again, I just grabbed these online. These are some free textures I found. You could grab any textures you want. That should suffice. Just make sure they're seamless and repeatable. So I'm going to use this sand texture to start. I'm going to right click on it, and in here I'm going to come up to create, and I'm going to come down to terrain layer. It's right at the bottom right here. See terrain layer? I'm going to click that, and that's going to give me my first layer. I'm going to come here and say sand. Okay. Now, actually interesting, in this version, in 2018, you could actually right click on it and create a terrain layer, but it looks like in this one they don't automatically apply it, but that's okay. Looks like we have a sand layer we've created here. So I'm going to go ahead and associate this texture with this sand layer. So right now it's saying assign a tiling texture. If I click on the layer, I'm just going to go ahead and grab this and drag it right into that texture slot. So now you'll notice in here I've got 2 things. I have sand, my texture, sand.jpg, and sand, my terrain layer, right? I'm probably going to just name this sand layer just to differentiate the 2. They kind of look the same when I look at the thumbnails down there. So in my terrain, if I go ahead and click back on my terrain in the scene, and I go to my paint tool, and then you'll notice we have this terrain layers area under paint texture, right? Now what we need to do is associate this sand layer that we created with our terrain layer. So I can go ahead and click this Edit Terrain Layers and say Add Layer. Okay. Oh, let's see, Add Layer. There we go. And when you click that, you should get this little dialog box that looks something like this. And it'll look for the layers that you have in your project. Well, we only have one sand layer right now, so we're going to go ahead and use that sand layer. Okay. Now with sand layer selected, you'll notice that I have this first texture I can actually use to paint on my terrain. If I come into my terrain now, I can start painting this sand onto my terrain. Okay, and you'll notice also on this sand layer, I have my specific material properties associated to it. If I had normal maps and other things of that nature, I could add those here. If I had, if it was more metallic or more smooth or more like a glossy or water, I could adjust those settings here. I can also adjust the tile size settings right here. So I actually might change these to like 5 and 5, make the tile a little bit bigger. And these aren't multiplying how many tiles per unit. These are the actual tile size. So I'm saying, hey, I want to make this 5 units big by 5 units big. Okay, it's a little bit different than some of the other tiling settings in Unity. So you'll notice I have my sand on there, right? I can come around here and just kind of paint this sand all over, wherever I want. Maybe I'll make a giant brush up here, come down to it right here, and I could just really just paint this guy up however I want, like so, right? Now we need to differentiate it. We've got one texture on here. You can see everything looks like sand, and if I zoom in, it looks pretty much like sand, right? But I want to add these other textures. I've got Mossy Rock and Cliff. So to do that, I need to create some extra layers to apply to this particular terrain. So we've got our sand layer, right? I'm going to go ahead and create another layer. Right click, create terrain layer, and we'll call this one Mossy Rock. All right. And that's just because I'll call it Mossy Rock layer, just to differentiate it. And that's because I have a Mossy Rock texture, so I'm just calling it that just for naming purposes. Whoops. Let me go ahead and grab my texture, and I'll go ahead and drag the Mossy Rock to that texture. We've got our Mossy Rock layer. I can go ahead and click on my terrain, go to my paint settings, edit terrain layers, and I'm going to go ahead and add my Mossy Rock layer. So now you see I start to build this palette of things I can paint with. So you can select them just by selecting whatever's in your terrain layer to actually make your painting. But if I click on Mossy Rock now and adjust my brush size below here, maybe even the opacity, I can now come in and start painting that Mossy Rock along my terrain. So maybe on these mountains right here, I'll come in and do that here and there. Just kind of spray paint that in right there. All right, and come over here, paint these in. Let's paint these little hills here really quickly. Add this Mossy Rock. Now you'll notice the tiling plays a big part when you're doing your terrain. It does look very tiling right now. Like there's lots of, the same texture everywhere. So when you're painting terrain, you want to get in the habit of kind of breaking it up and also adjusting your tile size so it feels appropriate. Right now it seems a little small for what we're doing. So just like I did on the sand, I'm just going to come into here. Let me just paint a little bit more of this terrain. And I'm going to adjust this tile size to probably something like, let's go to 10, see how that looks. All right, that's already looking better. All right, so we've got this Mossy Rock. Set to 10. Adjust my brush size and just kind of come in here and kind of paint this up. All right, come over here. And I'm just kind of tapping around in here to kind of fill in the gaps where necessary. All right. In here, painting, painting, painting. All right, I'm just kind of filling this up. And you can get super artistic with it, which you should when you're actually designing terrain. But for now, I'm just kind of showing you the process real quickly. I'll come in here, maybe just grab a different brush, maybe more of like a pepper the edges here a little bit. Okay. So we've got a couple different textures in here right now. We've got our sand-based texture, right? We've got our mossy rock, and now I need to add another texture for my actual cliff texture. Let me go ahead and just grab some of the sand real quick and just paint maybe a little bit of this in here just to kind of fill that in. Okay, that looks good. All right. So we've got our mossy rock, but it would be nice to have some cliff texture to differentiate it. And the great thing about this is you can add really as many terrain textures as you want, but they recommend only doing 4 for any particular piece of terrain. I'm doing 3 on this demo, but you could add 4 if you needed to. So in here, I'm going to create another terrain layer. Right click, create, go down to terrain layer. We'll call this cliff layer, right? And then again, I'm going to associate this texture with my cliff layer right here. And I'm going to click on my terrain, go to my paint settings, going to click edit terrain, add terrain layers, grab my cliff layer, and now I have this nice cliff layer where I can come in and add a little bit of this cliff texture in here as well. Right, these are nice mountains. You'll notice the tiling right now, it's tiling maybe a little too much, right? A little small. So I can just come and change the size of those tiles. So maybe for this one, we'll do something like 15 and 15, right? Might be a little too big, maybe like 12 and 12. This is kind of like your preference when you change those tiles. And you can see it kind of updates on the fly too. As I come in and just kind of pepper around here, add some little pieces in, and just kind of paint some elements up. All right, so I'm just kind of coming in here. And just painting some textures here and there to kind of make this feel like my own. There we go. A couple little more in here, right? You can see very quickly, just using some nice paint tools available in Unity, we can come in here and just start painting up a little environment as kind of like a base layer. So I want you to get in the habit of creating these terrains as a base layer in your project that we can then add stuff on top of, right? So using Pro Builder like what we were doing before, for our next project, we'll be creating our terrain base layer, and then we'll be just sticking our Pro Builder objects into this scene to make it a complete level, right? We can utilize both. You know, the terrain kind of fills in the gaps. It's kind of like the base behind everything that sits on top of it that you can actually play on, right? And you can kind of adjust it as you go. So have fun with that. Create your terrain, put your materials in, create some material layers, adjust your terrain accordingly. Use the set height to create paths. You know, if I come in here again, just to show you, if I go to my set height, and maybe I take this brush, and I'll come into my settings. So I'm just going to shift click an area I want to build a pathway. So we'll come down here and we'll make a small little path right around here. Get that height. So I've got 9. Maybe we'll even set it to just 9. Right? I can come in here and just paint that height throughout my project. So if I wanted to make a little passageway back here, it goes out to a little area over here, right? I can do that by using that set height. So I've made a little pathway, right? I can then come in with my smooth height. Maybe I'll smooth out the transition between that pathway, some of the edges here. And then I can come in with my paint texture, grab my sand, and then start painting that area in here to kind of show that pathway, right? So that's pretty powerful when you're using the set height to kind of make little pathways and areas you can go in your levels. It's like little hidden little hidden passage back there, things like that. So play around with that. I'd love to see some of that in your guys' level designs. Just get imaginative with it. Come up with your own designs. If you want to use like a lava texture or something else, feel free. If you want to create your own textures, that's fine too. But show me your scene. When you do your screen captures, try to get it as big as possible. If you want to just turn off the, let's close this tab, close this tab. Right, want to turn off that bottom project window just so I can see it. Give me a couple different angles of what you've created, right? Take some screen caps and upload them. So have some fun with the terrain, get comfortable with it. Use the terrain layers, to your disposal to create some nice textures and create something cool. Thanks, guys.